The world has changed. It changed 1 year and 14 days ago when George Floyd was murdered outside a convenience store in Minneapolis. Our country changed 1 day and 1 year ago when the storm of protest that erupted in response to that terrible crime inspired demonstrations in my home city of Bristol to pull down the statue of the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston. And from that moment onwards, the borderlines in this country between politics and political calculation on the one hand, and the study and the public discussion of history on the other began to blur. At the beginning of this year, I wrote an article in The Observer in which I predicted that in the coming year, historians and certain specific aspects of British history would become targets in Britain's new and destructive culture wars. It was, in truth, not much of a prediction. It was merely an extrapolation of trends that many people had already identified during the preceding 6 months. All the signs were already there. In the summer of 2020, in the strategies adopted by government and parts of the press after the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, and in debates about what are called contested heritage and contested history, phrases I want to come back to later, it was clear that history was to be a critical theatre of operations in those so-called cultural wars. Now, 6 months since that article, that prediction that it contained has been borne out more fully than I feared at the time. Now, I self-identify as a pessimist. I also have a long history of clinical depression, and I've spent much of my professional life studying slavery and colonial genocide. So there is a good reason often, in my case, to hope that my worst fears and predictions might be exaggerated. On this occasion, I'm afraid it paid to be a depressive pessimist with an interest in colonial exterminatory policies. What I want to argue tonight is that what we are witnessing is a serious attack on history, on the academic freedom of historians, and on the capacity of organizations in the heritage sector and elsewhere to deliver public history and to freely explore and to freely expand the breadth of the histories and the narratives that they present. But before talking about that, I want to explain why it matters to me personally. I came to history, I discovered my passion for it, thanks not to my formal education at school, but thanks to the medium I've now spent 20 years working in, television. I had one remarkable history teacher at school, Guy Faulkner, a key figure in my childhood to whom I owe a great debt of thanks. But it was on history that was on television that history really fired my imagination. And there I had other teachers, and chief among them was my now friend and colleague, Professor of Public History at Manchester University, Michael Wood. Michael did what that other titan of TV history, A.G.P. Taylor, despite his brilliance and his eloquence, was unable to do, which was to make history not just seem important and not just clever, but also cool. History presented by Michael was about story, it was about travel, it was about the interpretation of evidence, of landscapes, it was thrilling, it was real, and it was urgent. And as I came to history through TV, thanks to people like Michael Wood, rather than through the classroom, history for me has always been public history. I loved studying history at university, but at 25 I made the decision to go and study journalism, because a qualification in journalism was then seen as one of the few routes into the closed world of television documentary, open to those without wealth or influence or contacts. I took that path with all the earnest conviction of a 25-year-old because I was absolutely certain that I wanted to make history programs on television. What I really wanted to avoid becoming was a middle-aged history professor giving a lecture in a suit. So as escapes from destiny go, it was one of the least successful of all time. People who know me today know me because they've encountered my work as a television presenter or the author of history books. But half my career has been spent as a television producer, happily behind the scenes, learning the craft. And I still work as a producer. My name still appears at the end of programs little noticed. I made my first documentary 20 years ago. I made the first documentary that I was proud of in 2004. And it was about the German genocides in Namibia between 1904 and 1908, the appalling crimes that just a couple of weeks ago, Germany finally acknowledged as a genocide, 70 years after the definition of that crime was developed. Throughout my career, making TV programs, and since 2005, writing books, two arenas of history have been most important to me. The first is working class history. I was brought up on a council estate by the Tyne, opposite the city of Newcastle, where my Scottish ancestors found work in the early years of the 20th century. Their histories, and the stories of people like them, have always been special to me. When I studied urban history as a second degree, what fascinated me most was not the Georgian squares and the grand terraces, but the history of the Victorian slums. The other arena of history that I've always been connected with is the history of the empire, as it is that history that explains how my mother and my father, a man from southern Nigeria, came to meet. In both of those areas of history, the lives of poor Scottish and English people and of black people and other people of colour who encountered British power in the shape of the empire, what I wanted to do was tell the stories that were not well known. What mattered to me then and what matters to me now as a producer, a presenter and a writer is bringing to wider attention histories that are known by academics but are not part of public discourse. I wanted to make programs that weren't about familiar subjects, history's greatest hits. To me, that would have felt like joining a band that only ever played cover versions. And that's what I've done, with varying degrees of success, varying degrees of recognition for my whole career. Other than making a few arts programs that I secretly converted into history programs, I have avoided working outside of history, to the frustration and annoyance sometimes of my former bosses and employers. I came into television to use the medium to tell history stories, not just to be in television. But now, rather suddenly, just in the past 2 or 3 years, and increasingly over the past 6 months, 2 decades into my career, what I have always been doing has suddenly become enormously contentious. Uncovering and exploring some hidden histories is, in the minds of some people, not the work of a public historian, but an assault upon the nation of which I'm a citizen. Something quite profound has changed. And of course, it's not just me and it's not just historians who are subject to these assaults. The so-called culture wars have morphed into a history war. But what we are witnessing are not general attacks on the subject of history, but highly targeted strikes on very specific arenas of historical research and debate. And you can see that in what has and what has not come to be defined as contested history and contested heritage. Those terms, with which we are growing wearily familiar, are used currently by politicians and journalists in ways very differently from how historians might use them. The great contestations, the famed controversies and debates that over the decades have divided historians, sometimes bitterly, sometimes personally, do not register within these new history war definitions. They are not what is meant by contested in its current highly politicized usage. Let's take an example from one field of study, the history of the First World War. For decades, successive generations of historians have contested and debated the causes of that conflict, Germany's responsibility for the outbreak of war in 1914, the role Britain played by the failure to make its position clear. Historians have ventured into the archives and emerged with evidence to charge the generals of that conflict with lethal incompetence. The ensuing lions led by donkeys debate rumbled on for decades, being bitterly contested every step of the way. Other historians determined to complicate the picture and rehabilitate trashed reputations. All of these controversies are what historians might regard as contested histories. Yet historians engaged in those debates do not find themselves derided in tabloid newspapers. The museums and the heritage organisations that might explore those historical controversies are not at the end of sabre-rattling about public funds. If we are to take at face value the complaints now being made against some historians and some branches of history, and analyse the terms most commonly used within those attacks, you might reasonably conclude that the opposition is to histories that are deemed too negative, those that show Britain in a bad light or talk down the country. Yet, stories of British military defeat, of political incompetence, of corruption, or of official incompetence, indifference, or class exploitation, all are deemed worthy of historical investigation. The historians engaged in researching those histories that explore those phenomena are not targets in this history war. Let me give you an example from my work that I think illustrates just how narrowly focused these ideas of contested history and heritage really are, and what the real focus of our current history wars are. As Nancy mentioned, I present a series on BBC Two called A House Through Time. Over 3 series, we've explored British history through the lives of people who lived in 3 British houses in cities Liverpool, Newcastle and Bristol. I'm speaking to you today from Leeds, where we are currently in the final stages of filming the 4th series about a house in this city. The stories of the ordinary lives lived in those ordinary houses, unearthed by a brilliant team of researchers and producers that I have the honour of working with, stretch from the 18th to the 21st centuries. They involve residents living in all strata of Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian and 20th century Britain. All of life is there, and inevitably there is tragedy as well as uplifting histories. Among the subjects explored in those 4 series have been domestic violence, child abuse, attempted suicide or possibly murder, bigamy, petty crime, prostitution, IRA terrorism, industrial injury, the exploitation of workers by employers, the exploitation of tenants by landlords, and the abandonment of children. The houses we have explored have been homes to women widowed in the First World War and people bombed out of their own houses in the Blitz of the Second. Residents have died of tuberculosis, cholera, syphilis and rickets. One 20th century resident died of HIV/AIDS. The research has repeatedly thrown up stories that I worried audiences and television reviewers might regard as having crossed a line. I've repeatedly been concerned about stories related to infant mortality, a depressing constant in the lives of the residents of our houses. And I've thought hard about how to handle those stories sensitively. And yet we need not have worried. Our audiences and television reviewers have shown remarkable resilience and a willingness to confront the harsh realities that shaped the lives of earlier generations. Over 3 series, none of those issues led to complaints or negative reviews. None of them were judged to have been too sensitive or too divisive. There has been no suggestion that any issue we have tackled was one that it would have been better and more tasteful and more appropriate to set aside and ignore. Only one subject in all those hours of television, in all those lives, has drawn criticism of reviewers and complaints from members of the audience. That one subject came in the last series in Bristol, when, unsurprisingly, a house built in the early 18th century by that city's docks turned out to have been the home to a series of merchants involved in different ways and to different degrees in the Atlantic slave trade and the ancillary trades and businesses that emerged around it. Discussing the housing crisis of the 19th century, the crippling unemployment of the Depression years, none of that was talking the country down or rewriting history or seeking deliberately to make people feel ashamed of, quote, their history. The wars and the diseases, the domestic tragedies that have cast the shadows over the lives of our residents, all of it was acceptable. None of it was regarded as too negative or too divisive. But the slave trade, that was a step too far. The reason for these inconsistencies is that the history wars are not an assault on history. They are not a demand for balance or for a more upbeat assessment of the nation's past. They are a campaign waged in defense of an exceptionist mythology that accrued around our understanding of the history of empire, of which the stories of slavery and race are part. They are at the same time a backlash against the global anti-racist movement that has gathered under the banner of Black Lives Matter and spread across the world. I spoke earlier about how, from my perspective, the work that I've long been doing is suddenly framed in new, hostile and disturbing terms. And of course, I'm anything but unique in this. Other historians, and perhaps more acutely, museum curators, have over the past 12 months discovered that processes they have long been involved in, practices that are long established and quite normal, have suddenly been classed as assaults against the nation and its history. Museums have been removing human remains from display cabinets since the late 1940s. Curators, particularly those in colonial-era museums, have long been working with communities and historians to challenge and balance and reframe the white Eurocentric prism through which the world was often viewed through the men who created those institutions. Those processes have been moving along steadily for decades. None of this is new. For decades, it carried on without sparking a backlash. The political nature of this confected conflict can be seen in the response to the toppling or the removing of statues. According to The Guardian, around 70 statues and memorials linked to slavery have been removed or in the process of being removed or taken off public display here in the UK. And here again, even when taking their own arguments on their own terms, the position of the history warriors does not hold water. In reaction to calls to move statues from plinths and pedestals on public display in our city streets and into museums, where they can be properly contextualised, the response has been that all statues, irrespective of the crimes committed by the men they depict, should remain on public display, but that they should be contextualised. Retain and explain is the name this idea has been given. However, when museums attempt to offer explanation and contextualisation to such statues, they are attacked. Last summer, when the British Museum removed a bust of Hans Sloane from its pedestal and kept it on public display, but placed it in a glass display case surrounded by artefacts and contextualisation boards that explain the multiple details of Sloane's life, including the fact that much of the wealth he used to buy his collection that became the nucleus of what became the British Museum flowed from his wife's plantations in Jamaica and the labours of the Africans enslaved there. This was condemned. The museum was attacked by multiple journalists. Surely, Hans Sloane was surrounded by more history rather than less history in his new setting. Surely he had been both retained and explained, yet the museum was accused ridiculously of unfairly locking Hans Sloane in a glass case. If the glass case in which Hans Sloane has been placed is the only one in the British Museum that has been locked, then the British Museum needs to urgently conduct a review of its security policies. Similar attacks were made just a few days ago, just yesterday. After a year in storage and having been stabilised and conserved, the statue of Edward Colston was, as you may have seen, placed back on public display in Bristol. The statue, unable to stand upright, having been toppled from its pedestal, was laid horizontally and surrounded by interpretation panels that explained Colston's history as a slave trader in the Royal Africa Company and that laid out the rather bizarre history as to how a cult of Colston emerged in Bristol in the late 19th century. He has been retained and he is now better explained, far better than he was for the 125 years during which he stood on a plinth in the centre of Bristol. A plinth on which there remains a plaque that falsely claims the statue was erected after public subscription, a plaque that is silent about the 85,000 human beings Colston was complicit in enslaving and the 19,000 he was complicit in sending to their deaths. Yet the response among journalists and among one art critic conscripted into the history wars to this act of retention and explanation was hysterical. Here are two men with deep financial ties to the Atlantic slave trade whose statues in different ways have been retained and explained, put on public display in ways that provide vastly more information to the public of 2021 than those who saw them in situ in 2020. And in both cases, this did not satisfy those leading the charge in the history wars. As a nation, we have passed through the looking glass whenever issues of empire and race and slavery are raised. Placing statues in museums, surrounding them by information that sets them in context and explains their full careers, is framed as destroying history. Members of Parliament, including those from the party of law and order, are happy to declare their opposition to the return of stolen property, so long as the loot in question was stolen in the pursuit of imperial power and expansion, and the keepers of the stolen goods are museums. And histories, always the histories in question under contestation are those linked to empire, slavery and race. Is there any other aspect of British history that could have inspired the recent attacks on the National Trust? Historians, museum curators, the directors of heritage organisations, all of them now accused of seeking to erase the histories that they've dedicated their lives to expanding and enriching. We have to be clear, politicians are not the only ones engaged in these attacks. In many ways, journalists are more tenacious and more illogical in their assaults. In recent weeks, we have seen those determined to defend the British Empire, expand their horizons, and even defend the German colonial empire, but only because the German government admitted to historic genocide in Namibia. Back in April, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the Secretary of State for Defence apologised for the historic failure to equally commemorate soldiers in Africa who fought in the First World War. Those apologies came in the aftermath of the publication of a report by a commission that was assembled in response to a Channel 4 documentary that my production company, I'm proud to say, produced. Yet even then, even after an apology from the Prime Minister, from the Secretary of State of Defence, there were still those in the press determined to defend and qualify and explain away the racialised thinking that led to this scandal, even after the government, even after the Commonwealth War Graves Commission itself had admitted that what had happened was indefensible. If pride and shame, positivity and negativity, talking Britain down were the real issues, this would be a different case. But they are camouflages for other complaints. What are the real motivations animating and encouraging those engaged in these new history wars? Occasionally, there are those who admit that this has nothing to do with positivity or negativity or talking down Britain, and occasionally they are willing to accept that they are willing to discard aspects of British history. Last year, the MP, Marco Longhi, joined the feeding frenzy of attacks made on the project the Colonial Countryside National Trust Houses Reinterpreted, that was directed by Leicester University. In an interview, he said, quote, "Why do we need to be told by the National Trust that we have those links? It seems to me that they have an agenda to make us feel guilty about our past." That is, in my view, an astonishing thing to say. It is astonishing because there is no attempt to deny that those links are real, that they do exist, that they are part of British history, as Professor Corinne Fowler and her colleagues at the Colonial Countryside Project have amply demonstrated. And Mr. Longhi was not claiming that these linkages to empire and slavery are fake history. We have those links, he says. This is knowingly a call for willful ignorance about certain aspects of British history. It is a demand for academic incuriosity, and it is founded upon a deep sense of entitlement. The entitlement of those who believe history exists to make us feel good about ourselves as individuals and as a nation. That history's function is to comfort us rather than challenge us. That the past is a theme park of nostalgia and heroic narratives and warm emotions. No true historian, no true student of history would ever nurse such a delusion, yet there are those in positions of power and influence who do when it comes to the histories of empire, slavery and race. The history wars are dangerous, not just because they're born of delusions, they're dangerous because they arrive at the very moment when the history ecosystem in the UK has finally and belatedly come to acknowledge our own failures, and to challenge and change the Eurocentric character of much that is taught in our universities. And the historic failures of the heritage sector and publishing and other sectors, including television history documentary, when it comes to diversity and inclusion. The new history wars are part of a political response to the rise of global anti-racism. And historians and history are merely collateral damage, but the threat to us is real. Not just to history as it is taught and researched today, but perhaps even more so to the future that so many people now understand we need to forge. Our failures as a discipline, both in academic history and public history, have been many and multiple. The calls to decolonize curricula at universities and in schools, the demands for the publishing industry to widen the range of voices it empowers and the stories that it tells have become so loud and so urgent now, in part because they were ignored for decades. The depressing record on career progression of non-white and particularly black historians within academia and their experiences of racism within British universities, as outlined in the Royal Historical Society's Race, Ethnicity and Equality report, have long been evident, yet little was done. The lack of a pipeline, never mind a breakage to such a pipeline, of black students studying history and going on to PhD was equally clear decades ago. Recent acknowledgements of these historic failures and attempts to broaden access and advancement within the discipline risk being too little, too late, as the threats of closure of history departments in several post-92 universities risk setting us back even before we've had a chance to take a full step forward. Recently announced or proposed plans to close history departments at Sunderland, Aston, London South Bank and Kingston universities are a threat to the diversity of histories, both socioeconomic and racial. Because the universities considering or planning to abandon history are exactly the universities that, as the Royal Historical Society has noted, serve, quote, predominantly first-generation students from low participation backgrounds and in some cases a high proportion of BAME students. For decades, too many young black people rejected to study history at A-level or university because they felt the subject was not about them and therefore they concluded it was not for them. Recent assaults on black history, the history of the empire, the history of slavery, disguised behind the inadequate phrase culture wars or history wars, risk convincing them that the conclusions that they had long reached about the subject of history were correct. Let's remember that the colonial countryside project at the National Trust that has been under such unprecedented assault was a youth-based project. Young people working with historians to highlight linkages between the histories of British country homes and those histories of slavery and empire. The histories that relate to many of those young people from BAME backgrounds and their families. Those young people witnessed at first hand the ferocity of those determined to keep those histories in the margins and in the shadows. Why, in the face of such hostility, would those young people conclude that they live in a country in which history is for them? I think the first thing is we have to be brave, and it's difficult. I mean, I've noted in the past 6 months or longer, I mean, historians have been supporting each other, historians engaged in these histories because they've been under assault. Now, I'm somebody who's been in public history and in television for many years. I signed up to being a public figure a long time ago. Many historians have not, and yet they've been subject to very, very public attacks. I think we need to support each other. But I think we also need to think about the optimism and the possibility of this moment. When I talk to young people engaged in history or studying history, they're absolutely unshakable, atavistic belief that history is about justice, that the arc of history bends towards justice, to quote Martin Luther King, that it is their generational duty to rebuild the world and to rebuild the universities of which they're part and the histories which they study. I think it's one of those moments where young people can actually lead, and it feels a far more exposing place if you only read the newspapers and if you forget the attitudes of young people. So I think we need to take strength and solace from the attitudes of the young. Remember that the attitudes of the young are the direction our society is going to move in. And I think we need to be courageous, and we need to support those who are being courageous and being attacked for it. We know these changes to history are necessary, and they were happening naturally. They were happening too slowly, but they were taking place anyway. It's because this natural academic curiosity and inquiry was leading us in those directions. We need to stick to what we were doing because we did it, and we were doing it because we knew it was the right thing to do. Absolutely. And I think I tend to always say the same thing about this point, is that what I've noted in history publishing and in history television is there has been a tendency to use the reality, the fact that history is not a subject that is attracting minority students in large numbers, as an excuse for inaction. Now, that's of course not what I'm suggesting that you're doing, but it's something I've watched being done in publishing and history. And the phrase I always use at this point is that something can be not our fault, but it's still our problem. It is absolutely true that there is a problem that stems from school. It stems from the way the subject is received, the way it is taught, that stems from the curriculum, the sense that you get of young students from minority backgrounds feeling this is not for them, this is not their subject. That's all true, and you can see that in the numbers studying A-level, the numbers studying university, the very, very small numbers studying to higher degree, and then people going on to publish history at degree level or in the trade press. it's very easy to say that this is another part of the ecosystem, but we are all part of the same history ecosystem. So something is not our fault, but it is our problem. I think we need to fight for history altogether. We need to fight for every part of the history ecosystem. My little small part in that is that I never imagined I'd write history books for children, but I wrote the book that you mentioned earlier, Black and British: A Forgotten History. I kept being asked by parents to write a children's version of that because there just weren't the resources, and there's still not enough resources for parents of any race to teach children of any race about Black British history or the histories of empire and slavery. I think we need to look at this as a world of history of which we are all part, and the failure for all parts of this country to embrace it and feel it a subject for them is something that is a crisis for all of us. I think in government is a different matter. What I've noted from people, particularly in the heritage industry, is an incredible level of bravery, a recognition that these assaults are unwarranted and unmerited, that they are political in nature, and that they must not allow the changes, the advancement in the delivery of public history to be knocked off course. And I don't feel in a position to recommend courses of action to people who I think are behaving with remarkable bravery. But I think we do need to identify this as an attack on specific forms of British history, not see it as a general attack on history, and name it for what it is. This is an unwillingness to accept Britain's role as an imperial power and the role of Black people within, and other people of colour within the story of Britain. It is not a coincidence that the statues that are contested are those of colonial figures or those of figures to do with slavery. It is a very narrow attack. And I think when one aspect of history is under assault, I would call on the support of all historians in all fields to recognize that and to support their colleagues in the part of it, the discipline that's being pilloried and politicized. I think we've always, as a nation, been uncomfortable with aspects of our past, which is why we've buried them and concealed them. I think what's happening now is that the millennial generation aren't uncomfortable with it, and they are determined to discuss it. They're determined to challenge it. And the discomfort that we avoided having by never engaging with these issues, never discussing these histories, brushing them under the carpet, maintaining a version of British history that had the stories of slavery and empire, the development of the race idea, airbrushed out, sometimes so perfectly that you can't see the surgical scar of where those histories have been amputated. That form of history is no longer possible because we have young people who demand something different and who have access to resources I didn't have when I was growing up, where they can see those histories, they can see the missing links. When I was at school, I didn't have the internet. I didn't have access to the range of books that exist today. I couldn't see where excisions had been made in the histories that I was being telling, and all that the history I was taught at school it wasn't a particularly politicized history. It reflected our natural attitude. We don't want to talk about certain aspects of the past. We've edited them out. We've done it perfectly and surgically, and that worked so long as a generation never emerged that wanted those conversations that we have so studiously avoid. And I'm afraid that's exactly the generation we have. It's the generation who are demanding that history departments expand their curricula, and it's the generation that gathered around the statues of slave traders and slave owners in the summer of 2020 to demand that they were taken off public display. I think the first thing we need to recognize is that there is a willful blindness to that value. If you were we've just lived through a remarkable period in which our lives have been atomized. The value of history, the value of art, the value of music, of literature, of poetry, the amount of reading that's happened, the amount of engagement with cultural ideas that has gone on, the ways in which culture has been delivered in new and innovative ways. If there's ever been a moment where we should value what the arts and what the humanities bring to our lives and also bring to our humanities, then we've just lived through it. But this blindness to the value of humanities has been a sort of feature of British politics for the past, I think, 40, 50 years. The evidence, the sheer account, the simple accountancy that can be done of how valuable this is doesn't ever seem to have the political cut through. I mean, the British television industry is under constant assault. The BBC and the public service broadcasters live under a state of siege, and yet the value of British television to the economy, the amount of wealth that is brought in, the amount of innovation that is come, you only realize it as a television producer when you go to an international conference and everyone wants you to pitch ideas to them because they want British television producers. It's the same with British music, it's the same with British cinema, it's the same with British actors, it's the same with multiple fields of the humanities, that we deliver world-class products and services. And yet we live in a culture where, unless you're studying STEM subjects, you have to constantly be justifying this. I think there is a fight back. I see that in multiple fields. I think we need to sing and dance more loudly and more proudly, and show what the humanities have brought to Britain and what they bring in cultural, but also in balance sheet terms. I think you see exactly there, you see the generational divide. You see a generation of young players who represent the future and a generation of older fans who, I think, I'm afraid, represent the past, and a government that is willing to play the electoral strategizing around it. Those young players, and I've had the privilege of talking to the England team, they are remarkable young men, and they are, all of them, black and white, mixed race, they are taking a stand which is, I think, indicative of their generation. It's a very strange thing for someone of my generation who was brought up in the Britain of the 70s and the 80s to look to the England football team as a place where I see advancement on the ideas of race and equality. It's a very difficult thing for me to look at the England shirt and the flag of St. George and see the way it has been transformed by Gareth Southgate and that remarkable team of young men into something that is a sort of sanctuary away from these racial ideas. If as you get older, the world seems more topsy-turvy. I mean, there's nothing stranger for me than the England team being a place where I go for inspiration in the struggle against racism. And I think we need to recognize just the bravery of our manager and those young men and the abuse that they're facing at the moment. I think it's tragic that it's being used for political calculation. I think they are, and I hope they do it gently. As someone who's not from that generation, they don't need history to perform the role that their parents and their grandparents, many of them, seem to need to perform. They don't need history to tell them comforting stories of exceptionalism. They want to confront the history of Britain, the warts and all, the good and the bad. And in some ways, and there's a risk of this being an extreme comparison, and I don't mean it to be, but I think we are in some ways in a situation a bit like the generation who emerged in Germany after the 60s. And this is not to compare British and German history, it's to talk about the generational relationship with history, because that was the generation that confronted their parents and their teachers and their employers about their complicity in what had happened during the Second World War. And that was an extremely fractious moment, but it was that moment of intergenerational stress in which a younger generation demanded an older generation be honest about the country and everything that it had done, that led to Germany's relationship with its history, which is remarkable and arguably unique in world history. Modern Germany's relationship, which I have to say does not extend to its colonial history, but to its history of the 12 years of the Third Reich. Germany achieved the relationship with that history that it has today, which is, I think, a model to the world, through that moment in the 60s, which was brought about by generational conflict. And I would like to think that we will have a process that is similar, though less painful.